Thank you, everyone. And John, so good to see you. I'm really grateful that you'll give the talk tonight. John holds the Distinguished Chair in Contemplative Humanities, which is an endowed position created through the Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And he also holds a co-appointment in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures, where he currently serves as department chair. And I understand that's a very time-consuming position. So as you and I have tried to catch up with each other in the past few days, John, and knowing that your days are wicked up by these awesome responsibilities. In any case, John's work focuses on Buddhist philosophy and contemplative practice, especially in dialogue with cognitive science and psychology. And his publications appear in venues ranging across both the humanities and the sciences, and they include works on Buddhist philosophy, contemplative practice, and their interpretation within scientific, philosophical, and cultural context. And in addition to all of this, John, our friendship has been life-affirming for many years. We have enjoyed many occasions of meeting each other in complex meetings with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and we've enjoyed great laughs, usually at the expense of each other. But mostly we've had the opportunity to learn together. So thank you, John, so much. And I'm really looking forward not only to your talk, but to this weekend.
I'm really looking forward to it also, Roshi. It's so great to see you again. It's been a while, long enough for your hair to grow out. And I must say that it's always a pleasure to connect with you personally, but also with the community at Upaya. Great to be back here virtually. Looking forward to someday seeing you all in person again, I hope. But one of the wonderful things about, this time is how we've discovered this virtual medium and a way in which we can connect with really many more people and to see each other more often in some ways, at least to see. It's really been, I think, wonderful for me to be participating in some of these events. And I just want to thank Upaya, I want to thank Noah and the community at Upaya for all the work that they do to make this possible. It's really a precious place, a place that spans the planet now in some ways, with its heart there inside the Zendo. So really wonderful to be back here again and to be celebrating our friendship, Roshi. I've learned so much from you, and actually from being at Upaya. It's really fantastic. And from all of the various friends that I've met through you. You mentioned to me that Tom Driscoll might be here tonight, and Pama Midya, a couple of people that I've met, just, amazing people that I've met through you and through Upaya. So wonderful to be here. And one of the topics I wanted to talk about tonight is something that Roshi and I have discussed at some length. And I think, Roshi, you have actually maybe written on this, although I'm not sure if you've written directly on it. You certainly have written on compassion, but what I'd like to talk about tonight is specifically self-compassion, and which is a topic near and dear to our hearts in some ways. So I think the starting place for self-compassion might be, oh, by the way, in the background, you may see, I'm on my own tonight, and you may see Echo in the background. Echo is a guide dog in training, but he is a puppy. So, and he doesn't have his guide dog vest on right now, so he's allowed to misbehave. So he might do that a little bit. We'll see. I hope not. One place to start with that is the story that many of us know about that meeting in the 90s. I don't know if you were there, Roshi, with His Holiness and, Sharon Salzberg, and I think John Kabat-Zinn was there, and a number of other well-known Buddhist teachers. And I believe it was kind of around a Mind and Life meeting, but actually sort of, like a side meeting of some kind with His Holiness. But in any case, teachers. Yes, with teachers, right, exactly. And His Holiness at one point sort of asked something like, what kinds of challenges are you facing? And I believe it was Sharon herself, our friend, who said, oh, well, you know, one challenge we face is that so many of the people who come to us in practice actually really don't like themselves. They even hate themselves. And His Holiness went, no, they don't. And it's like, what? You know, what are you talking about? And you know, it was a long time to make sure that the translation was actually, you know, that he was really understanding it, because it's actually pretty hard to say that in Tibetan in some ways. And when he finally understood, it was clearly like we're kind of shocked. This is not a thing that traditional Tibetan culture has had to deal with. It's not a thing even that ancient Indian culture had to deal with. So when we look at ancient Indian texts, we don't find any reference to the idea of this as an issue. And therefore, we don't find any reference to the notion of something like self-compassion. We can't find, I haven't seen a text yet where that actually occurs either in Sanskrit or in Tibetan. Swakaruna would be one version, I guess. Ranglang Ningje in Tibetan. Haven't found any text. We do find in recent years, of course, we find teachers talking about this more and more as a result of connection to the West. And one of the cool things you can do is you can get on Google Ngram, just Google that, and which is great because you can type in phrases. You know, and Google has scanned all of these English language books from the beginning of the 19th century, and you can type in phrases. And if you type in self-compassion, you'll see there's nothing until like about 20 years ago, basically, as you know, Kristen Neff, great scientist and who's really one of the leaders in this world of self-compassion, began to write about it, and other people as well in the early and really at the start of the 21st century. So it's suddenly something that sort of skyrockets in terms of appearance in publication. But if we go, we're not going to find it in a Buddhist text, this term. And the real question is, well, why don't we find it? What's different on the one hand? And on the other hand, are there analogs? Like what is there nothing like this in Buddhist texts? And I think actually we can find a kind of analog. And that's why the title of my talk is not just about self-compassion, it's also about so-called going forth, or in the other term, with the term in Tibetan of ngenjung, definitely arising, which is often translated as renunciation. So we're going to look at that term in relation to self-compassion. But let's just first understand a little bit what the role of compassion is, specifically in Mahayana Buddhism, the form of Buddhism that arises, as many of you know, at the start of the Common Era. That the Maitri Karuna, you know, loving kindness and compassion is always an element of Buddhist practice. Well, from the beginning, it would seem the idea of the four immeasurables, right? Where we have immeasurable love, compassion, love, compassion, joy, and equanimity, that those four are their practices that seem to be very old. But in Mahayana, in the Great Vehicle, compassion starts to play a very specific kind of role. And the role that it plays there is basically that you could say that the early version of sort of the goal, the notion of where we're trying to get to, is nirvana. But nirvana is understood as a kind of cessation. Now, exactly what happens after nirvana, as you know, if we look at the older texts and look at the Pali Canon, it's often kind of, you know, if you ask that question, it's like, oh, look at the bird, you know, we're not going to answer that question for you directly. But basically, the modality is in some sense a kind of, at least from the standpoint of Mahayana, it's a kind of cessation or even a kind of escape from the Mahayana perspective. And so there were at least perhaps some members of the early community who really did see it as a kind of just an endpoint, kaput, it's all over, you know, the fanciful etymology of nirvana, meaning blowing out the candle, right? That nirvana, so that kind of image of nirvana as just an end to thing changes. And when it changes, one of the ways of thinking about that change is nirvana is now neither located it's not in samsara, obviously. It's not in the world of suffering, the cyclic existence of suffering, the merry-go-round. It's not there. It's also not beyond, it's not elsewhere. It's not in this land of cessation, so to speak, somehow in an endpoint of whatever it might be, whether it's eternal bliss or something, but something other than samsara. But rather, the new version of nirvana comes to be called apratishthita nirvana in Sanskrit, which means unlocated nirvana. Neither in samsara, nor in some quietistic, end of samsara, like an anesthetic state, right? It's neither of those. So this unlocated nirvana is, in a sense, one way of understanding that. And some of the early, ways of working this out philosophically are that wisdom is what keeps us out of samsara. It's what frees us from samsara. The wisdom that sees the nature of reality, that sees things as they truly are, what's called yatha bhuta darshana, seeing things as they are, as they truly are, seeing not even things, just seeing as it truly is, so to speak. So that's what, in a sense, wisdom is. And we could talk a lot more about it, and we will this week and talk a little bit about wisdom. That's going to be an element of what we talk about. But then there's also compassion. And what compassion does is it keeps one out of that anesthetic state, so to speak, that just cessation, just kind of blank me out, so to speak. With those two options, like samsara on the one hand, and a kind of cessation, like almost an anesthetic cessation on the other hand, a kind of blackout state on the other hand, then there is this new version of nirvana, which is in neither place. And of course, that also then comes with the idea that samsara itself can become the locus of a kind of nirvana, of this unlocated nirvana, through a radical transformation, right? Where, as Nagarjuna says, na samsarasya nirvanat kimchadasti visheshanam. There's no difference whatsoever between nirvana and samsara from the ultimate perspective. So what's compassion doing there in that context? What's compassion doing? Well, one thing that it's doing actually is it's actually a motivator, right? Compassion is motivating us to get beyond a certain level of insight. So as the tradition develops, the way this is expressed is basically that there are two kinds. So, what are the chains that are holding us in the prison of samsara, which is the typical metaphor that's used? What are those chains made of? They're actually made of our own confusion. They're made of ignorance, those chains. And there's actually two kinds of ignorance that the philosophical traditions of Mahayana talk about. One version of this ignorance is the kind of ignorance that actually drives us to be, naughty or something. I mean, to be basically that in a way, we're trying to be happy and all we end up doing is hurting ourselves and others. So that kind of ignorance is called the afflicted ignorance because it produces the afflictions, the kleshas, right? The negative mental states, our destructive emotions. So that form of ignorance is really all about, is a confusion about our own identity, who we truly are, what our true nature is. And that confusion, in a very simple way of saying it is, if I think I'm a car, then, I just pull into a gasoline-powered car. I just, pull into the local gas station and I'll just take a swig of gasoline and everything will be fine, right? Because that's what I need. That'll make me happy as a car. Well, no, that's not going to work, right? Because I'm not a car. That's not my nature. So we can constantly be trying to, in a sense, get what we think is going to make us happy. But if we don't know what we really are, in a sense, what our true nature is, then no matter what we get, it never works. We're never satisfied. So getting past that kind of confusion is crucially important, obviously. And that's what puts an end to samsara. So actually, the idea here is that one can achieve a kind of cessation of the suffering of samsara by putting an end to that afflicted ignorance. But one is not fully enlightened at that point. It's said that to get to the point where one is fully enlightened, an actual Buddha, one is now an arhat, is the term, right? One is a noble one. One has transcended the suffering of samsara and no longer susceptible to it. It's cut through that kind of confusion about one's own personal identity. But one is in some sense kind of, in a narrow space from the broader perspective of enlightenment itself. One has not cut through the second level, the second veil or obscuration, which is the unafflicted ignorance, which also basically means it's the kind of obscuration that prevents us not from just seeing our own nature, but from seeing the nature of reality itself. In a sense, it's what prevents us from becoming capable of truly seeing the world from other perspectives, like radically so, not just as a kind of idle exercise. So why would we want that kind of state? I mean, what would that be? I'm free of suffering, right? Everything's good. I'm not, no more afflicted emotions, no more, anger and clinging and all that kind of stuff. No more jealousy. It's like, hey, things are great. Let's just, enjoy or savor, whatever, but the thing is that at least from one perspective, you can't, in a sense, get away from everyone else, right? So I can be freed from that suffering, but the samsara is still going on. So at one level, you can say, of course, I'm free, but the suffering of others is still evident to me. That's part of it. In a sense, also, though, you could say that deep insight into my own true nature from the Mahayana perspective ends up being an insight into the world, because self and world, we can't make that distinction ultimately. And therefore becoming aware of our own true nature is a way of becoming aware of the nature of the world itself, which also means becoming aware of our interdependence with all beings. So in what sense can we personally be fully free from suffering if other beings are still suffering? That's one perspective. It's a perspective that drives a good part of Mahayana practice. But in an interesting way, you can also say that Buddhahood itself is only an endpoint, is only possible when we are motivated by more than ourselves, right? So this is kind of the more theoretical perspective, which is, in order for me to get through that final kind of veil of ignorance, which is what prevents me from understanding the way in which all things are radically interdependent, that prevents me from being stuck in a kind of static account of the world, and allows me to see the infinite flexibility of reality itself. That kind of breakthrough, if you like, requires incredible motivation. I'm not just going to do it for myself. That's the claim, basically, that in a certain way, compassion is the great motivator. And it can't be just compassion, for one or two people. It needs to be great compassion, mahakaruna, the great compassion, meaning compassion for all sentient beings, intent on freeing all of them from suffering. And that perspective, that is what enables us to actually break through that final veil of ignorance, the final obscuration, and enable us to see really radically the true nature of reality itself. So that's the theoretical perspective on what compassion is doing. Compassion is driving us, in a sense, it is this incredible motivator, actually, that enables us to do something we can't do if we're just motivated by our own suffering. And that produces the kind of wisdom that a Buddha has. And it is only possible with that motivation, according to Mahayana theory. And when you think about that, a couple of things become evident. One of them that's interesting, actually, is more speculative. You could say, from my point of view, is, well, what exactly is going on? So, yeah, it's a great motivator. The traditional thing is, unless you do tantric practice, which is dangerous, then, it takes 3 incalculable eons through an ordinary bodhisattva practice to become a Buddha. Like, yeah, you got to be motivated for a long time. That's requires some serious motivation, right? But also, what's the point of Buddhahood? It's not to get free of suffering, because you're long since free of suffering. That's not the point of Buddhahood. The point of Buddhahood is actually to free others from suffering, to serve them so that they can free themselves, actually. Which means part of what needs to happen is one, in a sense, has to become the best at doing that. That's the idea of that kind of maximal greatness is the term you find in the academic literature about this. Like the maximal greatness of the Buddha is that the Buddha is an amazing teacher, an amazing guide, someone who can really help people understand their situation, understand how they're confused, and then help them to overcome that confusion for themselves. Right? You can't, there's this famous phrase, the sages don't end suffering by the laying on of hands. Oh, no, excuse me. They don't wash away sins with water. They don't end suffering by the laying on of hands. They don't transmit, understanding into your mind, but rather by teaching the nature of reality, they free beings. And part of that perspective is like, one way, one of the things they say about the Buddhas is that when they are teaching, everyone hears something like 1,000 people, they all hear 1,000 different things because they're all hearing exactly what they need to hear from their own perspective. So true awakening is, in a sense, completely free of its own perspective. It's always from the standpoint that the teaching is always from the standpoint of others, which means you have to fully inhabit others. You can't have your own viewpoint in a way, right? And actually maybe Nagarjuna says, what's emptiness mean? It means the abandonment of all viewpoints. Like the Buddha doesn't have an opinion. Sentient beings have opinions. So that radical perspective, taking the perspective, really inhabiting the lives of others, of anyone else, that is, in a sense, also what compassion does for us. It enables us to see through the eyes of the other with care and kindness and concern for their suffering and for their happiness, actually, also, which is the love aspect. So when we think of all of those in terms of this is the basic kind of way of understanding compassion in Mahayana Buddhism, especially from a philosophical perspective. If we take a step back for a second and we think about compassion from the standpoint of, let's say, contemporary psychology and cognitive science, and also evolutionary accounts and such, one way of thinking about what compassion does for us as humans and why we have evolved, and many would say that we've evolved to be compassionate. Like compassion is a kind of feature of what it means to be a human, because compassion is what enables us to be good cooperators, actually. We humans can't live on our own. We can't survive on our own. We can't even have identities on our own. The developmental science tells us that, right? The famous developmental social psychologist Hazel Marcus says you can't be I or me on your own. You can't be a self on your own. You always are embedded in a social context if you're a human, but specifically a kind of context where we cooperate together, we do things together. We've been able to do amazing things, like one of us could make Zoom happen. Think of how many humans in this generation and previous generations have gone into this moment right here through cooperation. And part of what enables us to cooperate effectively is the sense that when we're in a cooperative group, that everyone's got our back, right? If you're groups that break down, where there are defectors, people, freeloaders, and so on, people, who no longer cooperate, and you can see this in communities, and this is part of the reason why Buddhists live in communities, is to learn this kind of thing. Being in a community, really, if you don't have compassion, it's going to fall apart. So compassion is what gives us the sense of trust. Like if I'm hurt, if I'm not doing well, if I can't handle this, they're not just going to, evict me. They're going to help me. And I'm going to feel the same. And even just innately, we feel that. So compassion also, like from this social psychological standpoint, evolutionary standpoint, compassion is something that we humans have innately, and it's something that basically bonds us together. Now, admittedly, it bonds us together into very biased groups. So, compassion can even lead to violence. Compassion for your in-group can be a motivator for violence toward an out-group. So of course, what we in Buddhism, what we cultivate is universal compassion. That's the point. But one feature of this idea of compassion that's important in that, especially in that context of like biased compassion, the kind of compassion that we feel sort of innately for our own kin, for example, for people who are close to us, our in-groups, that compassion really has a sense like who's worthy of receiving this? Who, in a sense, is on my team? At a certain point, if someone's really a freeloader or a defector, they're not helping the team anymore, they're not good cooperator, we're just gonna, leave them in the desert and move on. So that sense of, who's worthy, what's the worthiness, that's something that can then start to make us think about what's going on with self-compassion. So compassion, just to kind of recapitulate for a second, we can say it's a motivator. What it motivates us is to eliminate the suffering of others. And this, like, in social psychology, this is a typical way. First, you become aware of the suffering of another. You understand that other to be worthy of your response. This is not like a cognitive operation you necessarily go through consciously. You understand that and that worthiness is really largely dependent on perception of them as being in some fashion related to your in-group or part of your in-group. And then you want to remove that suffering. So it's all about seeing someone else, right? It's always about other. You're seeing someone else, you see their suffering, and you feel an urge to do something about it. And it's not what we call empathic distress, which is what Dan Batson, I remember Roshi, we spent some time with Dan Batson, and, it's like what Dan Batson did, these great studies, empathic distress is where I feel someone else is suffering and it makes me so uncomfortable. I'll be nice to them. I'll try to be what looks like compassionate in order to make them feel better. But if I have some kind of escape route, like it's a homeless person and I can cross the street, well, I'm just going to cross the street and then I'll feel better. So that's not real compassion. That's empathic distress. But real compassion is like, I see you suffering and I want to do something about it because, well, you're part of my group, right? In some sense or another. Now, when we think about self-compassion, it really comes back to this issue of, in some ways, of worthiness, actually. But to understand that, it might be a bit confusing at this right now, but to understand that, let's just think about what would be, in a sense, what's going on when we say people don't like themselves and we have self-loathing. And His Holiness was so shocked by this idea of, the self-loathing. How is that possible? One way of thinking about it is that this is not present in the early Buddhist texts, or really Buddhist texts right up to recent times. We don't find this, any kind of reference to this, and any reference to self-compassion, because, in a sense, apparently it was not an issue. There wasn't a problem, as far as we can tell. Obviously, there must have been people. You would have to imagine that there were people who who didn't like themselves at some aspect of themselves. But remember, in early Buddhism, especially, the idea is that the kleshas, and we see this even in Shantideva, right? Like the kleshas, the negative mental states, are my enemy. I want to defeat them. Yes. So I don't want to be, if I'm averse to my own experience, I won't be able to examine it. So I don't want to be driven by hatred and anger of my own mental states. That's not going to work. But I do want to get rid of them. I want to transform those negative mental states. It's definitely early Buddhism. But somehow that doesn't go into this place of self-loathing that leads to a lack of a sense of worthiness. So one possible way of thinking about this, which is something I've just been writing about recently with my graduate student, Jeremy Mannheim, is the possibility that there's something about kind of the modern period that leads us to a place in which we are, how to put it, there's something different about being a modern person in the so-called West, which really means Euro-America, right? And one of the ways of thinking about that is something that the historian and philosopher Charles Taylor has talked about, which is this idea of a subjective turn. And there's a great account of this in what is otherwise also a really wonderful book called The Making of Buddhist Modernism by David McMahon. And the basic idea of the subjective turn is that, starting in the modern period, some debate about where exactly we locate this turn, 17th century, 18th century, even 16th, a little tough to kind of pin down exactly. But certainly by the time the 19th century is rolling, and really well before that, there's this a kind of thematization of one's own subjective identity. A kind of inward focus on the individual who is, in a sense, kind of free of constraint, right? The transcendent individual of Romanticism, for example. And that inward focus involves a kind of storytelling, actually, of the self. Now, this idea of what we call autobiographical memory is connected here when we speak of this in psychological terms. We can talk about a self that's just the self in the moment, the perceiver. Sometimes we call this ipseity, just like the self right now, just the sense of being a perceiver, for example. But then there's this sense of an autobiographical self, a self that we kind of think about and tell stories about. And that subjective turn would seem to involve a lot more of that storytelling of the self. Suddenly people are, journaling and writing kinds of autobiographies that, unlike the Tibetan ones, Tibetans wrote autobiographies, interestingly, from quite a ways back. But there's this kind of personalization, interiorization, a talk about internal emotions. Even to this day, I did some little bit of research with an undergrad some years ago on Tibetans and emotions, and there's no word for emotion in Tibetan. But if you go up to average Tibetan, as we tried to do, and say, how are you feeling today? What are your emotions? They just look at you like you're crazy, basically. Like, what do you want me to go inside and figure out what's going on in there? And it's like, but that's a thing we do all the time, right? This kind of from a very young age, we are sort of taught to look in, to find the true self, to tell the story of the self, to have a whole kind of trajectory of that narrative of the self. And that storytelling in itself is maybe not a problem, but it does involve this kind of self-focus, right? And what we know experimentally is that self-focus correlates with depression, actually. The more self-focus you have, the more likely you are to be depressed. This is partially the result of a study that hooked people up with a device that basically recorded them throughout the day, sort of randomly. It was discovered that people who use the first-person pronoun more are actually tend to be more depressed, interestingly. And then there's been further other work where measures of self-focus correlate with depression. So that's in itself kind of interesting, but that's not maybe there's always already something there. But then if we think about not just that there's, maybe a problem with this much self-focus, but also that we're constantly needing to tell a story, that story is going to be in the framework of, our culture, a framework that maybe fills us with certain kinds of expectations, with certain kinds of identities, of ways with norms of ways we're supposed to be, the rules of the story, the narrative universe of the story. And if we don't live up to that, well, then what are we? Right? If we, I wanted to be an astronaut, and I went to the United States Air Force Academy to become an astronaut, and that was definitely the whole story was there, I saw Neil Armstrong and land on the moon when I was very young, and it's like, yeah, I'm going to go, escape this darn planet, beam me up, Scotty. There's no intelligent life down here. I mean, that kind of thing, right? It's a sort of adolescent transcendence, I guess, in some ways. And that story then fell apart for me, and I went through a really difficult phase then in my early 20s when I left the academy because I just couldn't stand the hypocrisy there. So there's an incompatibility between you might say, the self-image that we develop in the story, and then at some point, the self-image that we actually discover, right? And I think this can happen at various phases over the lifespan. It can happen, in the 20s. I think one way of understanding a midlife crisis is precisely this. Like there's a story of telling the self, then you sort of say, well, I've been ignoring the man behind the curtain for an awful long time, to use a Wizard of Oz metaphor. It's like, this story is just a bunch of, poop. I've been fooling myself. That's not who I am. And then, because we don't live up to that story, and we're, in a sense, have so much practice telling that story and turning inward that we think it's true, well, now what's the situation? We're not worthy. I don't deserve to be happy. Right? And a lack of worthiness, if we're unworthy, then why would we, deserve compassion, whether from others or ourselves? Now, in Buddhism, there's no practice of self-compassion, really. And this is what Bhikkhu Analayo, a really great scholar, and as kind of a friend who I'd hope to know better, and Bhikkhuni Dhammadina wrote this article a little while ago in the journal Mindfulness on self-compassion. And I have a forthcoming article with Jeremy Mannheim in that journal too, fairly soon, assuming the reviewers pass us. They basically said, like, the problem is that, in ancient India, it was just assumed that people had an unimpaired aspiration to well-being, an unimpaired aspiration to happiness, to flourishing. And that's just clearly not the case in our culture, is it? Like, there are a lot of us who don't feel that unimpaired aspiration because maybe we don't think we're worthy of it in some fashion. So in lieu of that, though, so one of the things, so how do we get past that? Really, that's a big question. One way of getting past it, of course, is something like self-compassion. But I'd like to emphasize that, it may be really necessary for us to literally do self-compassion. So literally compassion, really in psychology and in evolutionary accounts and in Buddhist theoretical accounts, compassion is always about somebody else. And when you look at the self-compassion literature, it often involves precisely this othering of telling the story of the self, where you're going to treat yourself like someone else that you're being kind to. So it's still in that kind of, self-focused perspective. But since we do that an awful lot, that we may indeed need to do that, like just develop different habits and to start to tell a different kind of story, a nicer story, basically. But the key here is not self-soothing. Like, it's not, it's okay. Because the traditional aspect of Buddhist practice that actually is kind of close to self-compassion is renunciation, which is, kind of not a great term, like definite arising sounds weird. Going forth, that's, maybe that works, kind of like leaving, the place you're stuck in. But the key aspect of renunciation is that renunciation is the motivation to free a sentient being from suffering. Like to notice the suffering and the motivation to become free from suffering. But it's about yourself. It's not about, others. That's why it's not called compassion. But actually, according to some accounts, like the only difference here is whether it's focused on others or on self. In some sense, it's kind of the same attitude. But, and here's a key, it's not about self-focus. Like if you have your hand on a hot stove, you don't kind of go like, oh, this guy has his hand on a hot stove, let's take it off. It's like, oh, my hand hurts, get it off. Right? You're seeing that from the first person perspective, not telling a story about yourself, but like feeling the pain and naturally becoming free of it, wishing to become free of it, motivated to become free. Just as we're motivated to remove the pain of others, being motivated to remove our own pain, right? A kind of natural motivation, both of them natural, actually. Compassion is natural, but biased. So we develop a form, we work to develop a form that is not biased, but we're still playing on that natural capacity. If my hand is, if my hand is burning, my natural thing is, ow, take it away. I don't need to tell a story about myself, right? So tapping into that is in a sense a kind of self-compassion. And some, I've had conversations with my friends and colleagues, Geshe Losang Tenzin in Emory University, and Geshe Thupten Jimpa, the chair of Mind and Life, who's done a lot of work at Stanford on this kind of thing, and they've developed independently programs that have certain resemblances, and they both kind of see like really we could say self-compassion really is renunciation. But for me, it is renunciation, except it's renunciation without the story, without the kind of turning yourself into an object. So I think that part of what then also is a key element here is really kind of dropping down into that, even into the pain, and letting go of the story we tell about what's happening. Like really getting good at not taking the story of the self seriously. In a sense, kind of unlearning maybe some of that subjective turn, that tendency to always be interiorizing, always be focusing inward, always be telling the story of the self. To let go of that, because of course the story is just a story, right? You are not a story. We are not a story. We need stories. They can be helpful, but if we take them too seriously, right, things don't go well, do they? I mean, you could say that conspiracy theories are all about stories that have gone awry. Some of them are be great science fiction, but so tapping into that natural urge to free beings from suffering, whether it's you or others, sometimes that urge is in that kind of self-other relationship. Sometimes it's just from your own first person standpoint, not third person, not turning yourself into an object. And here I just want to end by briefly kind of noting how part of what can help us with this is the kind of work that my old friend and colleague John McCransky has been doing, which is, part of the way in which in traditional Buddhism, people kind of were embraced in this sense of being worthy of receiving, of being worthy of being free of suffering. Like, we might say, oh, I don't deserve to be happy. I should suffer. This is just like, you just don't find that really in the Buddhist world, as far as I can tell. Certainly not in the text. And so what was part of the way in which these cultures kind of helped people to not fall into that place? Well, maybe not taking the story of the self too seriously is one of it, but another is the sense of receiving the compassion of the Buddhas, of the Bodhisattvas, of our teachers, of each other in community, right? So even the, like Upaya as the residents, like there's if you guys aren't fighting too much anyway, then that means you've got compassion. It's there. Receiving that, knowing that you're held by that compassion, right? That is, in a sense, a kind of antidote. And John has developed in his, I think, what is it called? Integral compassion training, ICT, I can't quite remember, or integrated compassion training. He's kind of developed a secularized, version of this, but it's also very much part of how we do, in Buddhist ritual. Like we always start with that. This is a thing that John really, I was I admit to at first being a little skeptical, but really, in a sense, he really tapped into something. These rituals always start with that sense of being embraced by the community, by the enlightened ones, by the bodhisattvas, by each other. And I think that's a very important thing for us to remember, right? Especially when we're starting to feel unworthy, to know that there are others who definitely think we are worthy of happiness and who do have our back. So Roshi, I'm going to leave it there. I want to thank you again for the invitation. Looking forward to the weekend. And it's always a pleasure.
Thank you, John, so much. This is a beautiful elaboration on this decades-long discussion that we've had about the viability of this notion of self-compassion. So full of appreciation. And please join us Friday and then Saturday and Sunday as we plunge into Lojong, mind training practice with deep emphasis on compassion. So we now will chant the 4 vows of the Bodhisattvas.